Herzlich willkommen zum Podcast Fokus Strafrecht. Wie immer mit der charmanten Nadine Zurkinden, Assistenzprofessorin für Straf- und Strafprozessrecht an der Universität Zürich. Hoi Nadine.
Hallo Claude und wie immer mit dem ebenso charmanten Claude Erik Bertschinger, Rechtsanwalt und Dozent an der ZHAW.
Nadine, wen hast du uns heute mitgebracht?
Heute habe ich Sarah Summers eingeladen, die uns etwas erzählen wird zum Thema Predictive Policing.
Also, wenn ich das richtig verstehe, vorhersagende Polizeiarbeit, könnte man das übersetzen. Was muss man sich darunter vorstellen?
Ja, ganz genau. Da geht es um vorhersagende Polizeiarbeit, kann man durchaus so übersetzen. Und die Polizei braucht Predictive Policing jetzt auch nicht erst seit allerneuestem, sondern schon seit längerer Zeit. Früher ging es vor allem um Tools, die auf Statistiken basierten. Und man kann da unterscheiden zwischen Tools, die auf Orte abzielen, also geografisch vorhersagen aufgrund von statistischen Daten, wo Straftaten mit hoher Wahrscheinlichkeit begangen werden, zum Beispiel Einbruchdiebstähle. Dann gibt es Tools, von denen ich nicht weiß, ob die in der Schweiz zum Einsatz kommen, die Voraussagen machen in Bezug auf Individuen, die möglicherweise straffällig werden. Jetzt hat sich die Technologie natürlich weiterentwickelt in den letzten Jahren. Wir sprechen immer mehr über künstliche Intelligenz und so hat sich auch das Predictive Policing weiterentwickelt und ist heutzutage weniger statistikbasiert, sondern es gibt mittlerweile auch Tools, die mittels Machine Learning Muster erkennen und dann aufgrund dieser Mustererkennung, Pattern Recognition, Vorhersagen machen, wo Straftaten passieren könnten und wer da allenfalls involviert sein könnte. Und darüber wird Sarah uns heute berichten. Ich bin schon sehr gespannt.
Ja, das ist ein spannendes Thema, von dem wusste ich auch noch nicht sehr viel Bescheid. In der klassischen juristischen Ausbildung, wenigstens an der Uni, habe ich eigentlich nie von diesen Tools gehört und dann auch in der Praxis, auch in meiner Erfahrung als Strafverfolger und Weiterbildung. Ich weiß auch nicht, ob viele StrafverteidigerInnen, also die Fachexperten wahrscheinlich schon, aber ob alle Anwältinnen und Anwälte immer wissen, dass ihre Klientschaft vielleicht gefasst wurde auf Grundlage von solchen Tools oder Ähnlichem. Das weiß ich nicht. Also da muss ich spekulieren, aber ich schließe von mir auf andere. Von daher ein sehr spannendes Thema, das uns Sarah Summers hier erörtert.
Ja, und du sprichst hier, wenn ich noch kurz darf,
ja, bitte.
Du sprichst hier indirekt einen anderen interessanten oder wichtigen Punkt an im Zusammenhang mit Predictive Policing, und zwar, dass es ja eigentlich primär mal um die präventive Polizeiarbeit geht. Und nicht um die Strafverfolgung, um die repressive Polizeiarbeit, wobei die Grenzen hier eben zunehmend verwischen, was dann ein weiteres Problem natürlich gibt, so aus Rule of Law Sicht, wie uns Sarah sicherlich erklären wird.
Fokus Strafrecht. Der Strafrechtspodcast der Universität Zürich. Für Profis und solche, die es werden wollen. Mit ihren Hosts Prof. Dr. Nadine Zurkinden und Dr. Claude Erik Bertschinger.
Today we have a very special guest, Professor Sarah Summers. Sarah Summers is Professor of Criminal Law and Criminal Procedure Law and Criminology at the Faculty of Law of the University of Zurich. She studied law at the University of Glasgow in the UK and received both her doctorate and habilitation from the University of Zurich. Her research interests lie in the field of criminal law and human rights. Her research concerns considerations of the empirical realities of criminal justice and of the importance of normative principles underpinning systems of criminal justice in the rule of law. She is co-director of the Digital Society Initiative, DSI, commission member of the Criminal Institute of the Canton of Zurich, a member of the Prosecutorial Regulatory Oversight Commission of the Canton of Basel City, and a member of the Board of Trustees of the KIHZ KIS Daycare Center of the University of Zurich and ETHZ. She is also on the editorial committee of Quaestio Facti, International Journal on Evidential Reasoning, and is on the editorial board of the International Journal of Evidence and Proof. This much I have learned from your biography page of the University of Zurich. Sarah, are you happy with that introduction?
I am indeed. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you. Thank you.
Welcome, Sarah. I'm very happy you are here today.
Predictive Policing.
Maybe we start right with what is predictive policing?
So predictive policing is the idea in some sense that you can stop a crime or prevent crimes being committed before they happen. So the idea is that what if you could stop a crime before it happened, and it's at once the promise but also the threat of predictive policing techniques. So these techniques, they promise efficient, proactive, not just reactive policing, lower crime rates, perhaps safer communities. But they are also accompanied, as we'll see, I think, in the course of this podcast, by a number of quite serious concerns about bias in already highly or overly policed communities, concerns about their potential to generate increased citizen and police tension. So these are some of the issues that can arise. And I think I can maybe begin by illustrating the idea of predictive policing with an example. And it's a very old example, but nevertheless one which I think might be quite useful for sort of thinking about these ideas. And it's the case of Robert McDaniel, who was a citizen in Chicago. And in 2013, he was visited by some police officers from the Chicago Police Department. And they told him that they were keeping an eye on him and he should just be careful about what he was doing when he was going about his day-to-day business. And he was surprised because he hadn't committed a crime and the police officers were not accusing him of having committed a crime. And what happened is he'd been put on the Chicago Police Department's strategic subject list, SSL, which was designed to determine whether people might be involved in a shooting. And this was based on their proximity to gun violence. And the data couldn't predict whether the person was going to be shot or whether the person was going to be the shooter. But the idea was that there was this proximity and he was on this list and there was someone that was a potential target or a potential criminal. And the police hoped in this case that by warning McDaniel that they would be able to avoid, obviously, him being the target or the perpetrator of gun violence. But in fact, it didn't work out quite like that. So this is quite interesting, I think, about this case. What happened was people in his neighbourhood noticed him speaking to the police. They were worried that he was then an informer and he ended up getting shot because people had seen the police visiting him. So we see here very much the worries, the dangers. But this is the sort of idea. This is the idea that by kind of working out who is likely to be a target or a perpetrator of criminality or violence, then the police might be able to get involved and try and prevent it.
And how did they think they could prevent him from being a target by telling him very unspecifically that he should be careful?
I think that's part of the problem is that the police get this data and it's still at the end of the day, the police there's a lot of expectations about the police experience and what they're going to do with this data and how they can use it to effectively target or prevent violence or criminality.
So there has been sort of a prophecy effect, basically, the fact that they have alerted him being cautious in his day-to-day has actually made him a victim of a gun violence in the end, right?
Yes, and I think this is something that we often, I think if we read the literature on the subject of predictive policing or think about the subject more broadly, we see these are the concerns that we see also in the context of location-based predictive policing. So the worries that by having more police involvement in certain areas, that this is likely to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. If the police are there more often, they're likely to uncover more crime. The fact of police intervention might result in not necessarily more criminality, although that might be part of the reason, like in this sort of case, but also just that more crime is uncovered and it turns into a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy where overly policed areas, there seem to be more crime committed there than in other areas. But I think it's quite important, I think, at the outset as well to think about the fact that predictive policing is very much a normal everyday fact of policing. So the idea that one tries to prevent crime is a very important part of the police mandate, as important at least as the repressive part of policing. So we have repressive and preventative policing. And in that context, predictive policing, even AI predictive policing, might be seen as something which is just a continuation of a broader phenomenon, of broader attempts to try and prevent crimes taking place. And I think we can see these attempts at prediction, at trying to work out who might be dangerous, for instance, in society. We see this, these are issues which there's nothing new. This is like something that we've seen in the criminal justice system throughout certainly the 20th century at various points in the criminal justice system. So we see like attempts at prediction, attempts at assessing or predicting dangerousness in the context of parole decisions. We see it in the context of sentencing decisions. So we might see that predictive policing is based on quite a distinct understanding of crime and delinquency, which is connected not so much to the structure of society, but more to the individual or social pathologies. And I mean, that's quite a dominant strand of positivism in the history of criminal justice system in more recent times. So I think it's important to see that. At the same time, though, I think, and that's perhaps what we want to discuss a bit more today, that there's specific problems associated with artificial intelligence and the increasing use of algorithmic models for predicting violence or crime.
May I go back just one step?
Yeah.
Because the case you mentioned was in 2013.
Yeah.
So did the police learn anything of that so that self-fulfilling prophecies do not happen that often anymore? Do they have strategies? Do you know anything about that?
What did they continue to use? Well, I think these types of systems are still quite prevalent in different places. In the Metropolitan Police in London use it's called a gang violence matrix, which is very similar in some sense, that you attribute a score to individuals who have been identified through their behaviour as being potentially likely to be involved in criminality. And
by involved, you mean as a victim or as a perpetrator?
Exactly.
So maybe for our listeners who are maybe not aware of all these tools that are already in use and how they work, if we had to simplify it a little bit. I mean, I recall having watched a movie back in the days. It was called Minority Report, and it was a movie from the year 2002. And they had these ladies in the pool, floating in a pool, and they were like alien-like. They had visions, and they could kind of extract those visions from what would happen in the future, and they would use that to prevent crime or try and prevent crime. Is predictive policing something like that?
I don't think we're quite at the level of Minority Report just yet. Yeah. I have to say, sorry to disappoint you perhaps. I'm not sure, but it's important, I think, to sort of like set out what is it we're talking about when we're talking about predictive policing. So on the one hand, we have predictive policing. That's been defined as something like the use of analytical techniques, particularly quantitative techniques, to identify likely targets for police intervention, and then to make like kind of crime prevention by making statistical predictions. And I think it's quite important to distinguish this kind of general idea of predictive policing from AI or algorithmic predictive policing. It's not the Minority Report level, but it goes rather in this direction that it's the use of algorithmically mediated data analysis for the purposes of finding patterns in data sets on which risk estimates are produced either for individuals or for locations and are operationalized, if you like, in the form of preventive measures, so targeted preventive measures. So we see here a distinction between statistical mapping, if you like, and the use of algorithmic tools to enable pattern recognition. This is a distinction that we have to keep in mind. And we have to also keep in mind that these two distinctions apply across these two major categories of predictive policing possibilities. So on one hand, the person-based, which represents an attempt to identify, as we've discussed already, individuals who are likely to commit or be the victim of crime by analysing factors like past arrests, victimization patterns, social networks. And examples include the Chicago strategic subject list that we discussed, this gang matrix used by the Met Police, But there's other forms of person-based algorithmic policing measures, which include also automated facial recognition systems, which have been used in London as well. For instance, a few years ago, the London police admitted that it had been supplying information. So it entered into something like an information sharing agreement with the private operators of King's Cross estate, which is a huge estate in London close to King's Cross railway station. And the police had supplied then ostensibly for crime prevention reasons with the images of people who'd been involved in crime or who'd recently been arrested. So this was a very, with a view to sort of like enabling the private operators of this estate essentially to probably remove people from their ground with a view to trying to prevent them committing crime. So very, very problematic, obviously. Another example is used in Zurich, this Darius in-team partner system, which is used in the context of domestic violence. But again, the idea is that people have drawn awareness to themselves in some sense. They become like
persons of interest.
Persons of in some sense without actually having committed a crime. So they've just drawn some sort of awareness from the police to themselves, and then they're subject to kind of like a risk assessment tool whereby there's like a scoring system to try and work out the extent of the risk that they propose.
Dr. B explains.
DRIS stands for Dynamic Risk Assessment Systems. DRIS Intimate Partners is a tool that assesses the current risk of a male individual committing a serious act of domestic violence. This tool has been developed at the University of Darmstadt Forensic Psychology section.
So this is like examples of person-based predictive policing. More widespread, of course, is the use of place-based predictive policing. And that's, I think, what we're also more familiar with here in Switzerland, whereby data is essentially analysed with a view to predicting when and where crime is likely to take place, with a view perhaps to enabling the police to send out targeted patrols, but not necessarily that. In the early days, there might also be a different type of response. And so if there's a lot of crime in a particular area, you might want to, increase the lighting in the area, put up more street lighting to make it brighter. And it doesn't necessarily have to be like a operational police patrol response. But I mean, that's typically what you think about, that they can send out police patrols.
So you made this distinction between person-based and place-based predictive policing. And you said in Switzerland we use the latter more, the place-based predictive policing. Does that have to do with the legal framework?
I don't think so necessarily, to be honest. Actually, so we go back, if we think about this, I mean, we have this Darius in-team partner that we use for domestic violence also in Zurich. That's very much a person-based tool.
True.
It might be to do with the legal basis in some sense because of this other distinction between statistical modelling and algorithmic tools in the context of predictive policing. It might be useful then just to compare the different types of tools.
Different models.
So Sarah, could you maybe explain a little further which are the different tools or how do they function? There seems to be certain differences between the tools you've been describing.
Yeah, so in the early tools, early methods of analytic methods of statistical modelling, such as pre-cops, which we also used here in the city of Zurich, they're very much theory-driven. So maybe it's useful to just discuss a little bit of criminological theory to explain what that might look like. So they kind of begin with a hypothesis, which is informed by the subject matter. So this idea of crime and criminological causes of crime and so on. So according to rational action theory, the decision-making of the potential offender depends on certain promising or unpromising offending opportunities of a given situation.
Can you make an example for this?
So it seeks, for instance, in the context of burglaries, it seeks to predict burglaries by using like what's known as a near repeat statistical observation that burglaries often occur at places close to places which have already been burglarized. So this is just a statistical observation. Yep. It's quite common that when a house has been targeted, soon after, other houses in this location in this area will also be targeted. And this is like a theory, but this is like something, a criminological hypothesis, which is borne out by empirical data. And it's well known in the criminological literature. And then there's like another hypothesis that's called, like in this context, the boost hypothesis, which tries to explain why that is the case. So it's like another criminological hypothesis which tries to explain why houses close are more likely to be burglarized in like a temporally near situation. This is the type of statistical modeling which these tools like Precob use. So they have a criminological theory, there's a hypothesis behind it, and on the basis of this, they use the data to try and work out then where there's like hotspots, and then they try to use that for operational police reasons, that resources are sort of put in this area with a view to crime prevention. So I think this is very important for our purposes here, is that these tools, they deliver results which are explicable from a criminological perspective. So you can look at the results and you can explain to people, well, this makes sense to divert resources to these regions which are being, and we can explain why this is happening, and it feels transparent. There's certain levels of accountability. It seems sensible from an efficiency perspective, and so on.
And what about algorithmic tools? Do they work completely differently?
I would say that complex algorithmic models, they're different. So PredPol is similar to Precobs to the extent that it aims to do the same thing. So it aims to tell the police where there are like hotspots for particular crimes. Burglaries, car thefts, robberies, typically this type of crime in particular locations. But the important thing, it's not theory-based, at least not chronological theory-based. These models are based on an algorithm which was inspired by seismology and the fact that certain crime patterns follow similar predictable aftershocks like earthquakes.
Okay.
So there's there's theoretical models, but the theory is not at all based on criminological theory. Nothing that we could explain in the sort of sense that I mentioned before with these theories about near repeat statistical observations and boost hypotheses and so on. Nothing like that.
I'm not sure I can follow. Maybe you can.
So you would need a geologist to interpret the data.
Exactly. So you have like theories like to do with like how likely it is that aftershocks will follow an earthquake. There's a big difference because the empirical basis of the statistical modelling tool that I mentioned earlier is experience of policing and crime and crime prevention. But in the context of let's say, PredPol or geological or whatever it's called now, sound thinking, there's no empirical basis in criminology. The empirical basis is in earthquake theory.
So it's basically math, underlying math or similar mathematical reasoning, like after an earthquake, there's this probability of this and this happening in the aftermath of an earthquake.
Exactly.
And then they have just realized that the math underlying principle may also apply or seems to apply also to human behavior with regards to criminal activity.
Exactly. That's exactly the situation. So they have this, it's called an epidemic type aftershock effect. And they say this sequence model is based on population genetics and epidemiology and notions of contagion, the idea that victimization can maybe be passed from victim to victim. And yeah. But the upshot of this is that any sort of understanding about how this system works, this type of algorithmic model, how this works, is limited. So we can't really explain the connection to crime or criminality or victimization patterns, or we can't explain anything about it.
So we have an opacity problem there.
Yeah, so it's theory-driven, but it's not driven by any sort of chronological theory. And then we can take this one step further with newer models, which are less well developed in Europe, but certainly being utilized actively in the United States. So models like that's like machine learning tools, which essentially allow the algorithm to learn from data and continually improve its performance by drawing like probabilistic inferences from the training data. And we have things like HunchLab, which has described itself as a patrol management system. It's used by the Philadelphia police. I think the company is based in Arizona, but the Philadelphia police are the ones that kind of pioneered the use. And it estimates the likelihood of crime being committed in a particular location at a certain period, so a certain time or something like that. So it uses crime data and algorithms to sort the data and combines that with a whole host of other information. So it might be the weather.
Do we actually know what kind of data goes into the system?
No, I think the point is that it's not just that we don't know which data goes into the system. That these systems actually are not that bothered by the type of data that goes into the system, because it's just essentially if it helps train the algorithm, then that's a good thing. And I think this is quite interesting to say that complex machine learning algorithms are said to generate accurate predictions, but there's no attempt to explain why that might be the case. And if we look at the people that are working on this, for instance, one criminologist who's a very big proponent, if you like, of these algorithmic models and machine learning models, Richard Beck, he said famously that if all other things are equal, shoe size is a useful predictor of recidivism, then we should use it as a predictor. So he said if there seems to be a link on the basis of the data between your shoe size and the likelihood that you're going to be a criminal, we should use that. So this is kind of the problem with these types of tools. We have generalizations, stereotypes, which are devoid of any sort of empirical foundation. So I think we'd call them like in the law of evidence, we call them spurious generalizations.
Did I understand correctly that one just puts all kind of data into the system and then lets
anything which might be useful. Yeah,
but how do we know which might be useful?
Well, the machine with time, that's to do with the way that it learns.
But if you do not give the system weather data or shoe size data, you will never know whether it will be useful.
Yeah, but remember, with these types of systems, particularly with machine learning ones, they're teaching themselves. It's like we're not even giving them the data anymore.
So they are collecting the data by themselves.
So it's not that. But I think the problem is, and I think we can see here that these types of spurious ideas, like some sort of connection between shoe size and recidivism, they are not absent from the history of criminological thought. Just to come back to patterns of thinking about crime and criminology. So if we think about phrenology, we had this idea that there might be some connection between head size or shape and likelihood to commit crime. So the history of criminological thought is not devoid of this type of spurious claims or thoughts. And the claims implicit, for instance, in Beck's idea of this connection between shoe size and recidivism or propensity to commit crime, they're almost certainly untrue. So there's real issues about the epistemic value, I think, of this type of pattern recognition in this specific context. But obviously, of course, this is bad enough if we're discussing, well, obviously there's no connection between shoe size and recidivism. But then there is, of course, deeper political and moral claims that we're all familiar with, that these generalizations don't just relate to shoe size. They relate to sex or gender or socioeconomic background, race. And so raise, of course, important questions about commitment to equality, non-discrimination, the rule of law.
So maybe we have to summarize this up in a bit of a dumbed down version for people like my humble self. So if I understood you correctly, so they were the old systems which were called statistical based.
Well, I've just like statistical modeling.
Or statistical modeled systems, which basically looked at all the statistical data collected, and they said, okay, there's crime all the time at Friday night in the region of the clubs here in Zurich.
Right.
Right. And then it's basically like a weather forecast. It tells the police maybe next Friday it would make sense to allocate your main sources somewhere in that region.
Exactly. Yeah.
To try and prevent crime by being present, show of force and that sort of thing. And maybe also catch criminals because they are most likely to be found there. And then the new not statistical, but the algorithmical systems, they are not based on these criminological theories, but they are based on the geological theories or whatever we want to call them, certain mathematical, seismic underlying principles.
Contagion theory from epidemiology or who knows.
And they can also be fed with several data that may or may not be relevant. And these are the more modern tools, if I understood you correctly.
Yeah.
So these are the two major distinctions in technology, I think. And then in the process, there's also these tools. You could also divide them in two groups. The ones that are more territory-based, right? Where they say, okay, there's more likely to be crime happening somewhere in the region of Altstetten, say. Yeah. And then there's the ones that are more individually based, where they say Claude Bertschinger is more likely to commit X, Y, Z.
Right.
Okay.
3 main issues.
So from a rule of law perspective, which one is the most problematic and why? Or are they all problematic?
So I think we can see a distinction between the statistical modelling on one hand and algorithmic tools on the other. And the main differences are, of course, that with the statistical modelling, we can understand why the things are happening. It's explicable. So we have like some sort of epistemic certainty. And of course, this type of statistical modelling is subject also to the dangers of profiling, discriminatory techniques perhaps, but these dangers, they're transparent. So we can say, well, if the police are sending, 80% of their resources to the Langstrasse, we might want to question that. We might want to say, and the police might have a response to that. So they might be saying, well, we've had a lot of crime there recently, and that kind of justifies the decision to do that. This is not like racially motivated. This is not like socioeconomically motivated, and one can discuss it. In the context of the pattern recognition system, so most of the algorithmic tools, we have quite important challenges. I would say I would group them into 3 challenges. I don't know if that's useful.
Yeah, go
Okay,
ahead.
right. So the first one, I'd say they pose like a criminological challenge, a challenge to our thinking about criminological theory, about crime and the causes of crime, and about how we're going to prevent crime. They even seem to, this pattern recognition seems to call into question the importance of criminological theory in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
It also puts pressure, I think, and that's quite important that we think about that, on notions of epistemic equality, our understandings of knowledge, what it is we're doing when we're trying to work out where crimes are likely to be prevented. The second issue, which I'd like to stress, is the worry, and this is not just these pattern recognition tools, but connected to the potential for widespread surveillance, that we have the worry that this central distinction between investigative policing and repressive policing is being called into question.
Mm-hmm.
To put this in a bit of a placative sense, you can't just, like in the rule of law, you can't just treat everyone like they're a potential criminal. And that's a bit the sort of direction we're going towards, where we have wide space surveillance, not necessarily through facial recognition technology, which has been curbed a bit, but through other forms of surveillance, and number plate surveillance, for instance, reliance on widely available geolocation data. And when these types of surveillance tools are combined with other algorithmic tools in the context, for instance, of predictive policing, then there's really worries about these traditional boundaries between repressive and investigative policing. So if we think about that boundary as being essentially reasonable suspicion,
Mm-hmm.
the availability of these tools is really putting pressure on the idea that police intervention can only happen when we have reasonable suspicion that someone has actually committed a crime. And I think that's one of the problems we see also in the case that I mentioned at the beginning in Chicago, of the SSL case, is that we say, it doesn't really matter if he's a potential victim or likely to commit a crime. And in fact, most of us would say it does matter. It's the very essence of this distinction between investigative and repressive policing in the rule of law. And then the third factor, very important, of course, is the issue of accountability, transparency, and the potential for introducing but also reinforcing bias in the context of policing decisions.
And when you talk about accountability and transparency, do you mean the police, or do you mean the companies that invent those tools and bring those tools on the market?
I suppose it's all connected in some sense. So if the tools themselves are not transparent as to the data that's being used or to the reasons for the decisions, then the decisions subsequently made by the police, whether that be like just basic decisions about resource allocation on the one hand, but also then more operational decisions, they're also then impacted by this lack of transparency and accountability in some sense, to the extent that if like the data is racist, then the operational decisions are likely also to be tainted by these initial problems with the tools. So I'm not sure that's something that one can really divorce, because the police, as we've just said, there's no way of them knowing why these decisions have been made. They can't explain it. We can't expect them also to explain because there's no explanations which are available in the language of criminological claims or the usual types of things that the police experience at the end of the day.
And when we come back to the second point, the widespread surveillance and the problem of the blurring between the preventive policing and the repressive policing, what could be possible solutions there? Do you have any idea? Or
There's several solutions. So one solution is just to try and prohibit the use or reliance or restrict the reliance on surveillance tools by the police, that one would strictly regulate in an effort to try and protect this distinction between police intervention, repressive police intervention is dependent on the moment in time where someone is suspected of having committed a crime. But some people say that this is a lost cause. So we'll see. It's interesting to see in the future whether it's actually going to be possible to sort of stem the tide of the technological advances, particularly in the context of surveillance, because the surveillance opportunities are so prevalent that it's perhaps unrealistic to assume that they won't be utilised by the police. But I think it's very important to be very aware of these dangers and to think very carefully about the potential for legal regulation to protect fundamental concepts in the relationship between the individual and the police and the rule of law.
And I guess surveillance is one issue, but the other issue is the data then used by AI tools to come up with certain patterns, as you already explained, which is something that I think you mentioned before we started recording the podcast, that is prohibited in the European Union by the AI Act.
Exactly. So this type of internet scraping for photos and data to build a database of to enable facial recognition, that's been prohibited now in the EU, and I think that seems an appropriate type of legal regulation, the type of thing that would be very important at the moment. And it remains to be seen. We'll see what the Federal Council decides to do in Switzerland. We're expecting a report in 2025, so imminently, on a broader Swiss approach to regulation of AI. So it'll be interesting to see whether they follow sort of the sceptical or more cautious lead of the European Union, or whether they're attempted to look to America, where it's a bit of a Wild West, it seems.
So one could say that the data protection laws are a bit of the fig leaf that protects us from being constantly surveyed by this police. So if we have stricter data protection laws, they can prevent or prohibit collection and analysis of all this.
Well, I suppose there's always been an exception to the typical principles of data protection in the context of the criminal justice system. Yeah. So, I mean, we wouldn't expect that to change in any sense. And I think what has changed is the willingness of people to surrender their personal data, not just to the police, but to private companies, right? So I'm guilty of that too. I have my location data turned on. I like to use it. I like to buy my ticket on my phone to take the tram. It's this willingness to surrender personal data to private companies, and that is perhaps at least as much of a subject as then deciding how we're going to regulate the use by the police of this data. And also very important, I think, which from a legal perspective, or a regulatory perspective, is then the relationship, of course, between the firms responsible for developing surveillance and algorithmic tools and the police. So between private firms and the police. That's something that I know that is of a real concern to the police authorities and how they should best regulate that. There too, there's questions about independence, about increasing privatization of what we would see as a public service, and so on. So
worldwide, if you look at the situation, there seems to be a bit of a spectrum, if I understand correctly, at least I hope so. So we've maybe all heard of this Chinese system, for example, with the social scoring system, where you basically tracked in certain cities, at least maybe all over the country, each and everyone is basically tracked by the state with cameras everywhere, facial recognition software and whatnot. And they track everything when you jaywalk or cross the street when the lights turn red instead of green, and maybe also have some predictive policing tools in the background running. Yeah, we've also in another episode talked about AI judges that then issue a ruling, also all automatically. And you also before mentioned that the US seems to be a bit of a Wild West in that area. In the EU, the protections seem to be a bit stricter. Is that also true for Switzerland? Are we closer to the EU situation, or?
I think we'd like to hope so. Yeah. I think there are differences between let's say continental Europe and the United Kingdom in the context of how privacy is perceived and the importance of privacy rights, which was certainly taken more seriously here in continental Europe than in the United Kingdom or probably in the United States. So that's for sure, I think, played an important part in the scope of the regulation. and the EU level. And we can just hope that the Switzerland is the proximity to the EU in view of the fact that it's a joined up approach to the regulation of artificial intelligence, which doesn't just focus on predictive policing. I think we can assume that the Swiss approach is unlikely to be too far removed from that of the European Union, would be my expectation.
But it seems to maybe historically also be a little bit connected with terroristic activities, for example. I mean, the UK had been victim, quote unquote, to several attacks, I believe, in the past. Maybe in the US with the 9/11 attacks and the aftermath of that, are they more prone because of that to maybe less emphasize the privacy of the individual and say it's the ends justify the means, sort of?
It's difficult to say. I mean, there might be a bit of that, but I think that recognition of privacy rights, my feeling is that this traditionally has been viewed less importantly in British political life, let's say, than in other countries. And I can't really speculate on the reason for that, but I think it has a longer, that these, in the weighing up of privacy rights against, for instance, freedom of expression, for instance, traditionally freedom of expression took considerable, what was seen as weighing higher, I suppose, in the Balancing Act. And what's interesting too is I think we see at least in the United Kingdom, following the coming into force of the Human Rights Act at the turn of the century, that had a big impact then, not just on privacy rights, but also on the regulation of the police. Because a lot of police activity at the time was not subject to a legal basis in law of the sort that we would understand as absolutely essential, let's say, in Switzerland or in other European countries. So a lot of the police activities were regulated in codes of conduct, but not in like formal legal statutes. And with the coming into force of the Human Rights Act, following incorporation of the Convention on Human Rights, that caused absolute upheaval in regulation of policing in the United Kingdom. There was a major revision of the whole law there. It was necessary on the basis of that. So I think the problems go beyond the newer issues with terrorism, or problems, if you like. The way that privacy rights are perceived has just a different constitutional past in the United Kingdom, would be my feeling.
So if I understood you correctly, and I agree, then the ends do not justify the means. So let's say, hypothetically, there were a tool to prevent or to foresee, similar to Minority Report or even further, to foresee you committing a crime somewhere down the road, 3 years from now, I don't know. Then the use of this tool would still not be morally acceptable.
Or epistemically acceptable. So I would agree that for me these things are absolutely connected. It's not just about the instrumental idea of preventing crime, and it's about also living together in a community where we can accept forms of power and authority that we have. So yeah, I would definitely subscribe to your position.
Because now, for example, if I look at Germany, currently they have this Aschaffenburg and all those sad incidents that had happened, and maybe in the light of this, the public or parts of the public might be proud to say, I don't care about the privacy laws or anything, I would rather the police would prevent that and they would use tools and find these culprits before they even do something.
But as we see, it's not as easy as that. So if we go back to the initial example with Robert McDaniel, they tried to utilize the tools for positive reasons, and the outcome was completely different. So I think the message here is very much that we have to think about outcome, but we also have to think about process and about the ways and means in which we want to do that, achieve the results, good results.
But what still strikes me about this case you mentioned in the beginning, if they think he possibly could be a victim, how come they did not protect him?
Well, perhaps they can't be there monitoring him 24/7. So they just kind of said to him, look, we think you might, we're worried that you might be a victim, or in fact you might be just involved in some type of gun violence, and that should be enough. You have to take measures yourself. But it's quite unrealistic. But you can see this too, I would say, and this is an issue too following Osman, a very famous case at the Court of Human Rights on Article 2, on obligations on police to inform people who may be at risk to life. So in these cases too, the police in Britain, following this judgment in Osman, the police have to, if they have some sort of reasonable reason to suspect that someone might be at risk to life, they have an obligation to go and tell the person. But they don't generally do much more than that. It's not like they will move them into witness protection or put them in there's no ability to do much more than warn them.
You mentioned prior this bias that it has a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So, I mean, we've distinguished these different systems, And one can be easier justified, so to speak, with criminalistic is probably the word.
Criminology theories.
Yeah. But still, I mean, even with the old tools, even with the statistical tools, right? The statistics could still have an underlying racial bias, for example.
Yeah, to the extent that that the bias exists in policing, and then it's possible that it's reinforced. And of course, the idea that if the police go to certain locations more frequently, then they're likely to uncover more crimes, or this seems to be very likely. I mean, this seems like a reasonable hypothesis. And I think that's why a lot of people do suggest that this type of hotspot policing might in fact just turn into self-fulfilling prophecy, whereby more resources are focused on a particular area, and because of that, this area, in fact, seen as particularly like, I don't know, a hotspot of crime or criminal activity or something like that. And it's also a question then about allocation of resources, I suppose, about whether one wants to allocate resources to crime which might be easier to uncover than other types of crime. So the idea that one might be more willing to police certain areas than to focus on white-collar crime.
So have there been studies about the efficiency of such tools? For example, you could say, if we use this tool in Zurich, and the tool says you should allocate more resources in Altstetten than in the Kreis Eis, and then maybe tell the policeman not that, but tell them like, okay, the tool said city center is likely to be a hotspot.
So I think for the early statistical modelling tools, determining efficiency or efficacy of the tools is quite simple in some sense, because the police have they have a lot of experience themselves, and they probably have a good feeling for what's working in the city of Zurich or not. And with the later tools, that's a real question about how, with things like PredPol and other tools, the real question about whether they're any use at all. How good actually are they at predicting crime? And there the jury is most certainly out. So there was a recent study that was sort of late 2023, I think, by Wired, that suggested that the PredPol tool was really, really bad. Had a 1%. I don't know how bad it was, but it was really bad in the context of robberies, for instance. So there was real questions on the basis of that. I think after this study, a lot of police departments in the States stopped using it. So there was obviously the police were not entirely comfortable or didn't think it was particularly useful. And there's been other like academic studies, a whole lot of like attempts to do like randomized controls of the use of these predictive policing tools, but the evidence is slant, I would say. It's very unclear, but also for their use. So that doesn't really necessarily speak for them at the moment. But you never know. I suppose the hope is that particularly with the machine learning tools, and that they would become more effective, if you like. So the fact that the argument might be it's early days, they're not effective yet, but they might become more effective. At the moment, I would say they don't seem to be very effective. That would be the feeling of the academic studies that have been conducted. But as I say, I think these studies, it's probably very difficult to get hold of the data to start with, and it's very difficult to conduct rigorous studies on the effectiveness of these tools.
Hopes and worries.
Maybe from an attorney's perspective, I'm also thinking about the process, because in my education so far, I've not even been really made aware that these tools exist, that police can have access to such resources, to such tools, which poses the question, is there a way of me even knowing that the police have used such tools in the process of finding my client? And is there a way of maybe countering this in a court of law, maybe question whether or not the use of such tools have been legal?
I think in the individual cases, I think rather not. So I don't think in an individual case you would have much luck as a defence attorney trying to challenge the use of, precobs in an early stage of the investigation. But I think the more effective methods or remedies have been through, a lot of the NGOs in Switzerland are quite active in like drawing awareness to the use of predictive policing, also facial recognition technology. Algorithm Watch is quite active, has a lot of good information on this sort of like policy making level. I think that's perhaps the more likely way of having some sort of redress then in that context. At the political level of regulating police activity, allocation of resources and so on.
What use of which tools is allowed or not allowed according to Swiss law currently?
Well, the regulation of investigative police conduct is within the responsibility competence of the cantons.
Mm-hmm.
Cantonal police law regulates the use of these tools, and there's a discussion even within Zurich, but also in other cantons, about the extent of the legal basis, whether that's sufficient for reliance on different tools. I think the feeling is that it's certainly not, there isn't a sufficient legal basis at the moment for the use of facial recognition technology, for instance. Mm-hmm. But the police obviously are of the opinion, for instance, the Stadtpolizei have been using some types of statistical modelling tools, and they are for sure there's a feeling at least that the cantonal law provides a sufficient legal basis for that type of activity.
So the future, what do you think the future might look like in respect to policy making and predictive policing tools?
I think in the short term, I think I would be very surprised if Switzerland took a different approach to the regulatory approach of the EU, which obviously means that the use of predictive policing of the type that I've been discussing, the algorithmic predictive policing, is likely to be severely curtailed. So it's not going to be, at least in the short term, it's not going to be used necessarily in Switzerland. But at the same time, I think we should be very much aware of the issue of surveillance. That seems to be the issue of availability of data. These seems to be the issues that are going to be very important in the future, and there's certainly also going to be putting a lot of pressure on this distinction between investigation and repression in the context of policing. So that's something that will have to be looked at, I think, on the political level.
So Sarah, what are your hopes or worries for the future of predictive policing?
I do quite strongly feel like in liberal democracies, commitment to the rule of law, to the idea that certain processes must be respected by the state in the prevention, in the investigation and punishment of crime. I think that's very important. And it's not just, I think that's also extremely, it's not just about the accuracy of decision making. It's also about the way in which decisions are reached. The process is absolutely central to ideas of fairness or justice or accountability in the rule of law. So I think when we think about things like crime prevention, we should definitely think about values such as dignity, community safety, promoting a system of democratic policing, which is accountable and responsive to citizens in society. My hopes for the future is just that we try to maintain a commitment to the rule of law. I think that's the essential point, that we focus attention on the importance of democratic policing and the rule of law.
Okay, Sarah. Thank you very much for being in the podcast today with us. It was very interesting.
Thank you for having me.
It was our pleasure.
Strafrechtsfokus.
Was für ein spannendes Interview, Claude.
Allerdings viele verschiedene Aspekte, die wir jetzt vielleicht nochmal aufgreifen müssen. Was meinst du, was ist dir hängen geblieben?
Ja, bei mir ist mal hängen geblieben, das mit der Self-Fulfilling Prophecy, also mit der selbsterfüllenden Prophezeiung, was ja ein Problem ist, das, glaube ich, wenn ich es richtig verstanden habe, bei allen Tools besteht und bestanden hat, auch bei den Älteren, dass wenn man an einem Ort mehr Kontrollen ausführt, weil die Statistik sagt, dort passieren mehr Einbruchdiebstähle zum Beispiel, man dann auch auf mehr Einbruchdiebstähle stößt, weil man halt vor Ort ist.
Also wer sucht, der findet.
Genau, und das ist etwas, das möglicherweise bleibt, auch mit den neueren AI-basierten Tools.
Es hat mich immer, als sie erzählt hat, immer wieder ein bisschen erinnert, auch an die Wettervorhersage-Tools. So, man hat ein Tool, das einem sagt, hier und hier braut sich was zusammen, geht da mal schauen. Und mich fand es interessant, dass sie auch gesagt hat, es ist gar nicht so im Detail erforscht, die Nützlichkeit oder wo sie erforscht wird, ist diese wenigstens bis zu einem gewissen Grad in Zweifel zu ziehen auch. Also das hat mich ein bisschen an den Wetterbericht erinnert. Eigentlich die Frage, ist der Wetterbericht akkurater als zum Beispiel in der Schweiz haben wir die Wetterschmöcker oder so, oder eine Person, die sagt, hier zieht es mir im linken Knie, morgen ist wieder Regen. Inwiefern sind diese Tools überhaupt genauer? Das scheint ja nicht wirklich belegt oder nicht im Detail belegt für alle.
Also genauer als die Erfahrung, die PolizistInnen sonst haben und auf die sie sonst ihre Einsätze stützen. Ja, und was bei diesen Tools halt auch immer ein Problem ist, ist das, was oft als Blackbox-Problem bezeichnet wird, was ich als Opazitätsproblem bezeichnen würde.
Vom englischen Opacity.
Opacity, genau, weil es halt opak bleibt.
Also undurchsichtig.
Ja, undurchsichtig. Welche Daten reinfließen, das kann man noch eruieren, je nachdem. Aber was das System dann macht, warum das System aufgrund von diesen Daten auf die Muster kommt, auf die es kommt, das kann man ja dann nicht immer nachvollziehen.
Das kennen wir zum Beispiel von ChatGPT. Also ich kann eine Frage reinschreiben, Enter drücken und dann kommt eine Antwort raus, die manchmal stimmt, manchmal nicht. Aber wie er auf die Antwort gekommen ist, was da gerechnet wird, das weiß ich eigentlich gar nicht.
Du hast ChatGPT erwähnt, da kommt mir spontan in den Sinn, also ChatGPT und Weather Forecast. Und bei diesen beiden Stichworten kommt mir in den Sinn, dass es generell bei AI-Tools ja ein bisschen das Problem ist, dass die am Anfang eher nicht so gut sind mit ihren Ergebnissen. Und die mit der Zeit aber dann doch richtig gut werden können.
Weil sie eben selber lernen.
Sodass wir sehr gespannt sein können oder besorgt. Und etwas anderes, was wir ja schon im Intro angesprochen haben, ist ja auch diese Verwischung von präventiver zu repressiver Polizei. Da das Problem, das Sarah Summers auch erwähnt hat, dass wir ein bisschen Gefahr laufen, dass irgendwann einfach jeder und jede als potenzieller Straftäter mal angesehen wird grundsätzlich, sodass wir dann irgendwann ein Problem haben der Unschuldsvermutung, der Presumption of Innocence.
Genau, das müssen wir vielleicht noch für die Laien unter den Zuhörerinnen und Zuhörern vielleicht noch etwas spezifizieren oder konkretisieren, was du ansprichst. Also aktuell ist es so, wenigstens bei uns im rechtsstaatlichen System, gibt es so diese zwei Funktionen der Polizeiarbeit. Also du hast das angesprochen, das eine ist eigentlich Prävention, dem sagt man sicherungspolizeiliche Aufgaben, die Polizei als dein Freund und Helfer, wie das so kolloquial tradiert wird. Und auf der anderen Seite hat man die Polizei als verlängerten Arm des Gerichts, die gerichtspolizeilichen Aufgaben, also die Aufklärung begangener Straftaten. Da gibt es eben diese Trennung, also der Grundgedanke ist, nicht jeder Mensch auf der Straße ist potenzieller Täter oder potenziell vielleicht schon, aber wird nicht entsprechend behandelt, sondern es gilt eben diese Unschuldsvermutung.
Also genau das Gegenteil im Prinzip, oder?
Genau.
Jede Person gilt primär mal als unschuldig und eben nicht als potenzieller Straftäter.
Ich weiß nicht, ich stolpere über das Wort potenziell, weil potenziell könnte man argumentieren, sind wir alle. Aber du hast recht, also man geht nicht davon aus, dass der hat was Schlimmes getan, sondern man geht davon aus, der hat nichts getan. Damit verbunden natürlich auch Privatsphärerechte und so weiter. Die Polizei kontrolliert eben nicht jeden wahllos, braucht Anfangsverdacht oder Tatverdacht. Und da beißt sich eben dieses Predictive Policing oder besteht die Gefahr wenigstens, dass diese moderneren Tools diese Grenzen verwischen, die ganze Zeit die Leute überwachen, obwohl sie eben, wie wir wissen, noch gar nichts gemacht haben.
Das ist wahrscheinlich auch der Grund, warum die EU hier sehr vorsichtig ist mit so AI Predictive Policing Tools und die grundsätzlich verbietet im EU AI Act und als Hochrisiko AI Tools einstuft, wenn ich das richtig in Erinnerung habe.
Ich meine, das auch so zu erinnern. Genau. Was ich noch interessant fand, war die Beobachtung, sozusagen das Ende oder die Spitze der Pyramide der Entwicklung wäre dann ein Tool zu haben, das eigentlich die ganze Zeit über jeden und jede von uns Voraussagen machen kann. Claude Bertschinger wird am 25. März 2033 bei Rot über die Ampel fahren.
Weil er Schuhgröße 44 hat.
Genau, und grüne Augen. Und dann hat man diese Aussage oder mit 87,5% Wahrscheinlichkeit über die rote Ampel fahren. Und was macht man damit? Und das fand ich spannend und auch wichtig, betonenswert sozusagen, dass sie auch gesagt hat, es geht eben auch um den Prozess, wie man auf dieses Resultat kommt. Mindestens genauso wichtig. Also der Zweck heiligt die Mittel nicht. Man kann nicht, auch selbst wenn es möglich wäre, ein solches Tool zu programmieren und einzusetzen, dürfte man es wohl nicht. Oder nur mit großen Vorbehalten, weil man damit eben eigentlich diese Rechte, die wir angesprochen haben, de facto eigentlich aufgibt als Rechtsstaat.
Das ist ein perfektes Schlusswort. Ich bedanke mich fürs Zuhören.
Ja, danke ich auch. Vielen Dank.
Feedback nehmen wir sehr gerne entgegen über unsere E-Mail-Adresse fokus@use.uzh.ch.
Folgen Sie uns zum Beispiel auf Spotify oder Apple Podcast. oder dem Podcatcher Ihrer Wahl. Nadine, herzlichen Dank, dass du mit mir diese Folge aufgenommen hast. Bis zum nächsten Mal.
Auf Wiederhören.